Hello, everyone. We're going to give it just a minute here because there's still some folks trickling in, and then we'll get started. Thank you all for coming. We're just giving it one more second here to allow people to trickle in. All right, I think we will get started. So, hello. If you don't know me, I'm Shiloh Brooks, and I'm the faculty director of the Engineering Leadership Program here at the University of Colorado in the College of Engineering and Applied Science. And for people who don't know about the Engineering Leadership Program, we're an undergraduate program, and we offer courses on the theory and practice of leadership. And we do this in a fairly unique way. In my view, we try to put philosophy, history, and literature into conversation with science and technology. And, in general, we think technical education alone doesn't fully prepare young engineers to confront the social, moral, and political complexities that arise from technology's influence on all aspects of modern life. And so our courses, if you're a student, take a look at our courses. The prefix is ENLP, and they count for social sciences and humanities credits that every engineering student needs to graduate. We also offer a certificate for students who wish to take multiple courses with us and engage deeply with our faculty and our curriculum. So thank you all for coming. Our lecture today is the third in a series that the Engineering Leadership Program is putting on. The series is called The New STEM Enlightenment, Political Promises and Perils of Science and Technology. And our previous lectures have included Bernhard Trout from MIT, who I think I may see in the audience, Aaron Dolgoy from Rhodes. There'll be additional speakers in the spring. The series will continue. The series examines how America's promotion of science and technology and scientific education affects American democracy and modern life. And I want to thank in particular the Jack Miller Center for funding the series, and CU's Benson Center for the Study of Western Civilization for helping us publicize the events and run the Zoom and get the registration squared away and taking care of the kind of back end of it. Let me give you some instructions. Of course, this is a Zoom meeting. It's not a webinar or something like that. You can see everybody's squares. We're doing it this way because at the Engineering Leadership Program, we like discussion, and we like discussion courses and face-to-face interaction. And so in keeping with the spirit of the program, we want Professor Craig to be able to interact with our students and our guests who may want to ask him questions. So what that means is that when he begins speaking, he'll be pinned to the screen and you won't be able to see anybody else. But then once we go to Q&A, we'll bring everybody back. And so you're currently muted, but when we go to the Q&A, we want to bring you back and let you ask him questions as best we can face-to-face, even though you're not seeing his real face, his face on a screen. So when you ask a question, what you can do is use the reactions at the bottom of the screen to raise your hand, or you can just raise your real hand. I'll look for people and call on them. And so, raise your Zoom hand or your real hand, and then unmute yourself, enable your video, and feel free to ask Professor Craig your question, and you can go back and forth with him a little bit if you'd like. There's going to be a live transcript, so you'll be able to see this at the bottom of your screen. If you want to enable it, you can enable the transcript, you can disable the transcript, but I just want folks to know that that's there if they're having trouble hearing the presentation. So with that, let me introduce our speaker. He's somebody who I've been wanting to get to see you for a long time, and somebody I know a lot about, and whose work I've looked at, and footsteps in a way I followed in. We went to the same graduate school at Boston College, and he was successful there and continues to be successful. Tobin Craig is an associate professor and a historian of political thought at James Madison College at Michigan State University. His work focuses mostly on early modern political philosophy and the rise of modern science. So those students in the engineering leadership program would know this is the subject matter of the 4,000 level course in the engineering leadership program. Tobin directs an interdisciplinary undergraduate program on science, technology, the environment, and public policy. And it sort of falls in the same channel as our HERPS program and the engineering leadership program both. He's published essays on all the great early modern thinkers on the question of modern science. You can think of people like Bacon and Descartes, utopian thought, the problem of science and democracy. He's won a grant from the National Endowment for the Humanities for a particularly innovative course called What is the Good of Science? And that course explores questions of how inquiry into nature is defended and justified. He's working now on a book-length study of Francis Bacon's project to refound natural and philosophical inquiry. And he's going to share some of that with us today. And for those of you who don't know Bacon, or maybe it's been a while since you've read Bacon, Bacon is the author, of course, most famously perhaps of the New Atlantis, but the New Organon as well, and is the founder in a way of modern science as we know it today. So thank you, Tobin, for being here. And with that, feel free to take it away.
Thank you, Shiloh. Thank you, everyone, for tuning in, as they say. It's a wonderful opportunity for me. The programs that you described, Shiloh, at CU really sound to me like they sort of mirror the ambition that we have for our programs here at Michigan State University. And, as a Spartan speaking to, I don't know, do you guys call yourselves Buffaloes? I guess I have to apologize for stealing your head coach, but we're very grateful because he's leading us to a great season so far this year. So thank you for that. The year 2020. Today, we can't help but think of it as the COVID year, a momentous year in the history of modern science. We're in the face of a novel disease, a disease whose origins remain surprisingly obscure. The entire globe turned to science, hopefully and expectantly, for advice, for understanding, for help. Not one or another nation, not here or there, but globally. I struggle to think of an event or a moment in my lifetime when the political significance of the intellectual authority of modern science was made so clear and so unmistakable. And it is right that we acknowledge that our science delivered. It delivered to us with incredible rapidity, not one, but several novel vaccines, which so far as we can tell are extraordinarily safe and effective. Over the course of this remarkable year, in our moments of leisure, seeking distraction from our anxiety or our ennui, I'm sure some of you, like me, were led to reflect on the situation of our ancestors when confronting similar or analogous plagues. Such reflections have surely led some of you to wonder about how we came to find ourselves in such a changed situation. And perhaps some few of you will have been led to notice the delightful coincidence that the year 2020 also marked the 400th anniversary of the publication of Francis Bacon's great instauration in Novum Organum, or New Organon. In the pages of this text, one encounters the first and still classic exposition of the structure and aim of an experimental, organized, cumulatively progressive, and politically institutionalized science. A science dedicated, or rather pledged, to the generation of noble discoveries that will ameliorate the condition of the entire human race. For those few who seek more than merely to marvel at the wondrous achievements and status of our science today, but who actually seek to recover for themselves the arguments and insights upon which it rests, I think Bacon's great instauration, which was published together with the New Organon, has no rival. So let us take the invitation afforded by this remarkable coincidence, and against the background of this vivid reminder of the power and the reach of the power of our science, return to the New Organon. So in what follows, I'm going to attempt to sketch an interpretation of the New Organon, I will suggest that contrary to an impression that Bacon went some lengths to cultivate and to encourage, his guiding concern in this work and in the Instauratio Magna as a whole is philosophic and not merely practical political. That is, while Bacon loudly and repeatedly avers that the true end of knowledge is the endowment of the human family with new mercies for the relief of man's estate, the amelioration of our earthly existence through the expansion of our powers over nature. And as we can see from others of his works, The New Atlantis above all, he thought deeply about the transformative potential of an institutionalized and technologically oriented science. But it was also, perhaps ultimately, with a view to advancing the cause of the effort to discover more of nature, to seeing more clearly what is, that Bacon worked. My remarks will have three parts. In the first part, I want to call to your attention some passages in Bacon's extant writings which indicate his philosophic concern or ambition, even that his philosophic ambition is from his own standpoint more important or fundamental than the practical political potential of his new science. That the new science, specifically its technological bent or orientation, is devised and urged with a view to advancing philosophy or the effort to understand the truth about nature. I then want to focus on Bacon's critique or complaint against the received philosophy with which he was confronted. What was its defect and what was the source of its failure? And this will then lead to an effort to think through how Bacon conceived of the contribution of his new science. Just how could Bacon's new technologically oriented science correct the defects of the received philosophy and lead us further into the discovery of nature? Let me begin now by calling to your attention two unpublished texts by Bacon, one familiar and one less well known. The first is the famous letter Bacon wrote to his uncle, William Cecil, Lord Burleigh, in 1591. The letter is famous as it is one of the earliest documents of Bacon's grand ambitions. Quote, "Lastly, I confess that I have as vast contemplative ends as I have moderate civil ends, for I have taken all knowledge to be my province." But let me point out something that is often overlooked about this letter. This great statement occurs in the midst of a letter imploring his uncle to find him a suitable place or office. Bacon's father has been dead for over a decade, and Bacon, who is now responsible for finding some way in the world, is in a pinched, if not quite dire circumstance. After his father's death, Lord Burleigh, Bacon's maternal uncle, had been turned to repeatedly to advance Bacon's career to no avail. Bacon has grown frustrated and suspicious of his uncle's failure to turn something his way. This grand statement of Bacon's vast contemplative ends is in the context of the letter introduced so as to remind the Lord High Treasurer and Keeper of the Seal that his nephew has alternatives to public service, alternatives that are far more to his liking. Thus he continues, quote, "If your lordship will not carry me on, I will not do as Anaxagoras did, who reduced himself with contemplation under voluntary poverty, but this I will do. I will sell my inheritance. I will purchase some lease of quick revenue or some office of gain to be executed by my deputy, and so give over all care of service and become some sorry bookmaker or a true pioneer in the mine of truth, which layeth so deep." To clarify Bacon's drift here, he's threatening to shirk his public and familial responsibilities and give himself over utterly to his studies if his uncle doesn't find him a job. He won't go quite so far as Anaxagoras did, but he will give up waiting for a place. "Your loss," he says, "and the family's disgrace," he warns. This is like a student calling home to a relative and threatening to drop out and become a ski bum if they don't find him a good job, preferably with lots of time off and in Colorado. But now, in addition to revealing something of the direction and intensity of Bacon's inclinations, the letter also clarifies that for Bacon, political place or position is of interest or desired, not as an end, but rather as a means to allow him to advance what he here calls his contemplative ends. But now, returning to the passage for which the letter is famous, just what are these contemplative ends? "If I could purge it of two sorts of rovers, whereof the one with frivolous disputations, confutations, and verbosities, the other with blind experiments and auricular traditions and impostures, hath committed so many spoils, I hope I should bring in industrious observations, grounded conclusions, and profitable inventions and discoveries, the best state of that province. This, whether it be curiosity or vainglory or nature, or if one take it favorably, philanthropia, is so fixed in my mind as it cannot be removed. Bacon's ambition, he here tells us, from which nothing will shake him, is to secure, quote, the best state of the province of all learning, specifically by purging it of two sets of rovers who spoil it, replacing them with more industrious and productive sorts. Now, by way of filling out this glimpse of Bacon's grand ambition, let me turn to a much less familiar text, the posthumously published Proem on the Interpretation of Nature. This is likely one of the earliest of the surprisingly numerous fragmentary drafts of the work that became the Great Instauration and New Organon. So far as we can tell, it dates from roughly 1603. It stands out, however, even from the other extant unpublished works for its autobiographical character. This is the only extant document we have wherein Bacon gives an account of the origin and motivation behind the project that became the Instauratio Magna. Now, this is not the place to give the work a complete interpretation, but permit me to quote a few especially revealing and important passages. The proem begins in Bacon's past, with a young Francis Bacon asking himself two questions. What is the greatest possible service one can do for mankind? And what service was Bacon, in particular, fitted by nature to perform? To the first question, Bacon first seems to say, quote, the discovery of new arts, endowments, and commodities for the bettering of man's life is the greatest service. But then he proceeds to revise this conclusion, quote, but above all, if a man could succeed, not in striking out some particular invention, however useful, but in kindling a light in nature, a light which should in its very rising touch and illuminate all the border regions that confine upon the circle of our present knowledge, and so spreading further and further should presently disclose and bring into sight all that is most hidden and secret in the world, that man, I thought, would be the benefactor indeed of the human race, the propagator of man's empire over the universe, the champion of liberty, the conqueror and subduer of necessities. Turning next to his second question, Bacon tells us, quote, for myself, I found that I was fitted for nothing so well as for the study of truth. From this point on in the proem, Bacon speaks only of his work, never clarifying just what he intends. He tells us that he has long sought office or place, but more with a view to the additional resources this would afford him in advancing his work. But then as he sees his age advancing, his health failing, his ambitions thwarted, Bacon concludes he must turn away from this great scheme and, quote, applying himself to that which he could do, which could not be done without the help of others, he was leaving undone that which he could do himself, and so failing to advance his work. Quote, I put all these thoughts aside, and in pursuance of my old determination, betook myself wholly to this work. Immediately upon announcing this resolution, and without any further introduction, he offers an appraisal of the intellectual situation he understood himself to be confronting. Quote, nor am I discouraged from it because I see signs in the times of the decline and overthrow of that knowledge and erudition which is now in use. Not that I apprehend any more barbarian invasions, but the civil wars which may be expected, I think, judging from certain fashions which have come in of late, to spread through many countries, together with the malignity of sects and the compendious artifices and devices which have crept into the place of solid erudition, seem to portend for letters and the sciences a tempest not less fatal, and one against which the printing office will be no effectual security. And no doubt, but the fair weather learning which is nursed by leisure blossoms under reward and praise, which cannot withstand the shock of opinion and is liable to be abused by tricks and quackery, will sink under impediments such as these. Now, this extraordinary series of remarks, which are unparalleled so far as I am aware in Bacon's extant corpus, reveals to us that our concerned lover of truth fears for the state of learning in Europe, and he foresees a new period of decline looming. The Reformation, which opened the way to a proliferation of competing sects, and which in turn begot the Catholic Church's counter-Reformation zeal, created a situation of warring Christianities, each battling to be more zealous and more pure, which sooner or later will mean more hostile to learning and philosophy. And this not merely because of the general danger posed to learning or philosophy by religion, quote, in all ages, but in particular because the edifice of European learning Bacon confronted rested upon an always potentially uneasy synthesis of Christianity and Greek philosophy. Compounding the peril, Bacon tells us, European learning is dominated on the one hand by a lazy and dogmatic establishment that completely lacks the wherewithal to defend itself against the shock of hostile public opinion, and on the other by a variety of quacks and cranks peddling pseudo-philosophical doctrines. Here we meet again the two sets of rovers who in the letter to Lord Burleigh are despoiling the province of all learning. The weakness of Aristotelian philosophy in works, one of Bacon's characters observes, quote, has produced in some quarters a high regard for alchemy. But the narrow range of the alchemists' inquiries, together with their boastful promises, make it even more easily and openly convicted of vanity and less able to defend itself in the eyes of most men than the received Aristotelianism. So far from dissuading him from his resolution, however, this exposition of the intellectual situation appears to be that which, at least in some degree, recommends Bacon's grand effort to secure the dignity of knowledge by, quote, works of utility and power. For as he proceeds to elaborate, in contrast to a tradition of learning founded upon a particular theology, this new unprecedented approach is invulnerable to the tempests arising from sectarian conflict. Quote, for the injuries therefore which proceed from the times, I am not afraid of them, end quote. By refounding the dignity of knowledge on a promise of works or fruit, he thus preempts the appeal of alchemy while also freeing philosophy from its dependence on an increasingly unreliable theological defense. Together, I think these texts, and the proem above all, demand a rethinking of what Bacon was up to in his published and programmatic works on behalf of a new science. They make clear that Bacon was self-conscious in his undertaking of the task of refounding natural philosophy and perhaps all learning, but that he did so, it would seem, precisely out of a concern to preserve, to protect, and to advance the cause of philosophy, and that he understood his grand ambition as contributing to the discovery of what is. Let me now take up and consider more fully with you Bacon's complaints or charges against the received philosophy. From the proem to the interpretation of nature, we have seen that Bacon's concern is with the precarious situation faced by philosophy in his time. And while I think this was for Bacon a serious matter, it is clear that this is not the only, or perhaps even the chief defect of the philosophy inherited from the Greeks. Quote, that the state of the sciences is neither prosperous nor much advancing, end quote. So begins the preface to the Great Instauration. If Bacon is perhaps best known for his complaint that, quote, the wisdom derived mainly from the Greeks is fruitless or barren, he is no less vociferous about its stagnancy, its immobility, its failure to advance or make any progress. Quote, if sciences of this kind were not evidently moribund, we wouldn't see what has been now the case for many ages, that they are motionless in their tracks and do not grow in a manner worthy of the human race. So that repeatedly, not only an assertion remains an assertion, but a question remains a question, not resolved by disputation, but only entrenched and nourished. And all tradition and succession of disciplines is that of master and pupil, not inventor and improver of the invention. In contrast to the mechanical arts, or indeed any live enterprise, where one sees steady, continuous, incremental improvement, and where there is no veneration for and even a kind of disdain toward the first authors, philosophy and the intellectual sciences stand like statues, adored and celebrated, but not moved forward. Bacon confronts a tradition, whatever the intention of its founders, that has settled into a dogmatism, a dogmatism that mistakes the study of certain texts and certain authors for philosophy, to the point that there is no active and ongoing inquiry into nature. So how then does Bacon explain this curious state of affairs? We can distinguish, I think, two key aspects to his argument. First, the tendencies of our nature, and second, the characteristics of the authoritative teaching. A successful teaching will appeal to these tendencies, flattering them by making them seem reasonable or prudent. Thus, for instance, the appearance of completeness or comprehensiveness. As he puts it in the preface to the New Organon, quote, "Those who have pronounced on nature as a thing already explored, whether out of confidence, ambition, or professional pride, have done the maximum harm to philosophy and the sciences. For as they have secured conviction, so they have effectively extinguished and cut off inquiry." How so? By appealing to our laziness. Bacon notes that lazy as we are, perhaps particularly in intellectual matters, and perhaps even more so on fundamental questions where so much is at risk, we are only too happy to give ourselves over to some one teacher or authority who presents the answers to all the pressing questions, saving us the trouble. Quote, "Once the sciences have been carefully cultivated and handled bit by bit, someone chanced to come along who famed and celebrated for intellectual daring and for the shortcuts of his method, established things as an art in its outward appearance. This is what his successors come to like, because it makes their work easier and spares them the tedium and weariness of new investigation." Close quote. Bacon's target here, clearly, is Aristotle. As he quips in the New Organon, "For after Aristotle's philosophy had, as the Ottomans do to their brothers, butchered all other philosophies with their cruel criticisms, it pontificated on every issue, and he sets himself up questions to answer as he pleases, so that everything is polished off without a trace of uncertainty. And this way of doing things has held and still holds good among his successors." End quote. But if man is naturally intellectually lazy and only too ready to give assent to apparent answers or to doctrines, still, these doctrines or teachings must have some plausibility, some basis in how things appear to us. The more so if such a dictator is to rule so many for so long. What then is Bacon's account of the remarkable appeal of the received philosophy? In the series of short aphorisms preceding the introduction of the idols of the mind, Bacon offers us something of an account. Having led his reader to trace the limits to man's power to the shortcomings of his sciences, Bacon turns in the 11th aphorism to an analysis of the shortcomings of the existing sciences. Quote, "The existing logic serves to entrench and firm up errors themselves founded on common notions, rather than to investigate the truth, so it does more harm than good." Thus, he continues in the 14th aphorism, "If the notions themselves, and this is the heart of the matter, are confused and recklessly abstracted from things, then nothing built upon them is sound." End quote. Because the received sciences accept as their departure point the common or primary notions as captured by words, and because these notions aren't reliable, everything built upon them is questionable. Quote, "What has been discovered so far in the sciences is for the most part subject to common notions. But to get deeper and further into nature, it is necessary to abstract both notions and axioms from things by a surer and firmer way." Then follows the famous 2 ways of investigating and discovering the truth aphorism. Here Bacon tells us that the received way flies up from the senses and particulars to axioms of the highest generality. In the next aphorism, he observes that this is our native intellectual tendency, at least for most of us. For the mind longs to leap up and find rest in the highest generalities, and so it is only too ready to give up on experience. Bacon is at pains in these aphorisms to insist that his science too will get to axioms of the highest generality, only that it will do so gradually and carefully, ensuring they are grounded in particulars and experience. The received science, he tells us, establishes abstract and useless generalities right from the start, while his gradually rises to ones really better known by nature. I note in passing, however, that shortly hereafter, Bacon will expressly caution against our mind's restless lust for cause of causes, which prevents us from accepting nature as we find it. This distinction between the two ways of contemplation then reappears as that between, quote, anticipations of nature and interpretations of nature. Anticipations, precisely because they appeal to the tendencies of our mind, are able to secure common consent. Indeed, they are far better at sustaining assent, precisely because they are gathered from a few facts, those most familiar to us, and they impress the intellect and fill the imagination. Now, the critique opened up here in these aphorisms is then broadened and deepened in the famous section on the idols of the mind. Bacon here gives an account of how it is that we can be so mistaken, why we are so susceptible to error that then blinds us to perplexing and contraindicatory phenomena, which otherwise would reopen our minds and reinstigate inquiry. Permit me to review a few of Bacon's remarks as they strike me as especially important in the present context. Bacon tells us that our minds are prone to supposing more order and equality in things than it actually finds. For though there are many things monadic in nature and quite unlike anything else, the intellect nevertheless counterfeits parallels, correspondences, and relatives. This nonsense holds sway not just in dogmas, but also in simple notions. We are especially susceptible, Bacon tells us, to judging everything by the few things that immediately appear to us or appear most clearly to us. Armed with these false classes or groups of instances, we, quote, pull everything else into line and agreement with them. Excited by affirmatives, we ignore negatives. But Bacon tells us the greatest hindrance and distortion comes from the weaknesses of our senses, and perhaps sight in particular. Quote, contemplation therefore almost stops where sight does, end quote. These tendencies of the human intellect are then further reinforced by language. Bacon calls the idols of the market, quote, the greatest nuisance. And this because we feel ourselves in charge of language when we are not. Language works because it is common, that is to say, available to even the meanest capacities. The articulations of the world made in language are only the rudest and most familiar. But when we try to, quote, move these lines the better to match them with nature, we are still limited by words. In the second of the two aphorisms discussing this class of idols, Bacon clarifies that it is precisely the partial accuracy of our words that is the real problem, particularly when it comes to predicating qualities of things. For here our penchant for metaphoric application takes over, and we end up grouping widely disparate phenomena under the same word. Summarizing now, Bacon's chief complaint against the philosophic tradition he confronted was that it was too much tradition and not enough philosophy. It had settled into a contented dogmatism and was no longer actively inquiring into nature. And the deepest root of this dogmatism, behind or beneath Aristotle's all too successful teaching, is the confluence of the limitations of our senses, the desires of our minds, and the easily overlooked power of language or words. Together, these tendencies blind us to phenomena which don't square with the doctrine. And so we don't ever feel the need to seek further, and we too readily conclude that the kinds that we seem to see and can't help but speak in terms of mark the true limits and joints of nature, that they are necessary. It is Bacon's task then in the New Organon as a whole, I think, not only in Book 1, to free his readers from this dogmatism, to teach them a new way of seeing nature, a way that leads them past the kinds or forms, and to reopen the question of just what nature is. In reading over the section on the idols, you'll note that while Bacon hints or gestures at remedies of several of them, one remedy recurs like a refrain. More instances, more carefully selected instances. But we need to be taught how to even recognize such instances before we can go out in pursuit of them. It is for this reason that while the new natural history will be the foundation of Bacon's new science, it is preceded by the New Organon. We need to be educated into this new way of seeing nature before we can be entrusted with the task of going forth into nature and the workshops to collect the relevant phenomenon of the universe. Thus, in part 2, the seemingly endless list of classes of instances that Bacon would have us attend to, all are part of this aim of re-education. Only after having led his reader through these does he give them their marching orders for the new natural history, although tellingly this too is called a preparative. This perhaps helps us understand Bacon's observation at the conclusion of the New Organon that in my Organon, I deal with logic and not with philosophy. But precisely this remark ought to put us on guard, given what we have seen so far. For Bacon effectively charges Aristotle with having insinuated a teaching about nature and anticipatory ontology through the teaching of his logic. Quote, Aristotle constructed a world out of his categories. And now Bacon presents a new Organon. Is he not imitating Aristotle's mode of proceeding, butchering his rivals and usurping the throne? And like every intelligent usurper, he presents himself as a liberator. But if it is the case, as Bacon says repeatedly in the early drafts of the New Organon, that, quote, the tablet of the human mind is not like ordinary writing tablets. On them, you can write nothing new until you have wiped away the old. But in the mind, you cannot wipe away the old except by writing in the new. If this is true, then it is not enough for Bacon to offer a critique of the received philosophy. Rather, it would seem imperative that Bacon also teach an alternative view of nature, a view that cannot be based on the findings of the inquiry for the simple reason that it is prerequisite for the undertaking of the inquiry. Pardon me. So finally, we approach what I take to be the darkest and most difficult matter. What is the new teaching on nature that Bacon is stealthily teaching? And what does he expect to be disclosed by the inquiry it supports and encourages? In this final set of remarks, I will focus on the early aphorisms of the second book of the New Organon. Let's see, do I have time for this? Let me point out a small textual detail that strikes me as intriguing. The title introducing the first book of the New Organon is, quote, Aphorisms Concerning the Interpretation of Nature and Kingdom of Man. The title introducing the second book is, quote, the second book of aphorisms concerning the interpretation of nature, comma, or the kingdom of man. What are we to make of the substitution of the or for the and the introduction of the definite article before regno hominis? The title to the first book would seem to announce the New Organon as a whole with two distinct topics. The title to the second book would seem either to identify the interpretation of nature with the kingdom of man, or to give the second book the specific title, The Kingdom of Man. We know from the important 115th aphorism of the first book that it has a primarily destructive purpose, performing, if albeit imperfectly, the three needed refutations of natural human reason, demonstrations, and of theories or received philosophies, which is preparatory to the art and rule of interpreting nature. Now, this remark on the work of the two books supports the suggestion that teaching this art of interpreting nature leads to, or somehow is, the kingdom of man. What does this mean? We should recall in this connection Bacon's early assertion that, quote, nature is not conquered except by obeying her. Indeed, the opening word of this book promising the kingdom of man is man, servant and interpreter of nature. The kingdom of man, it would seem, is ultimately the rule of nature. Seeking some way of making sense of this kingdom of man, we're led to the thought that the kingdom or rule of man is rule in accordance with nature properly interpreted, or that man is the highest of the beings. Man's supremacy over the rest of nature was expressly denied by classical philosophy, at least in its Aristotelian form. On the matter of the regno hominis, it is to the Bible that Bacon directs our attention in the final aphorism of the New Organon. Quote, for it is by his fall that man lost both his state of innocence and his command, regno, over the creatures. However, both of these losses can to some extent be made good even in this life, the former by religion and faith, the latter by the arts and sciences. Now, I don't mean hereby to suggest that Bacon presumes the truth of the biblical revelation, but rather that on this point, his own ontology is closer to that of the Bible than it is to Aristotelian philosophy. Nature, it would seem, is better approached as fallen or defective, as capable of being other than as it appears to us, and as rightly ruled by man rather than as beneficent and higher than man. And better approached not only with a view to its conquest, this to be sure, but also, I think, and more importantly, from the standpoint of a concern with its proper interpretation, with seeing it as it is. Now, perhaps somewhat surprisingly, Bacon begins the second book by distinguishing the work and intention of human power and human knowledge. Human power seeks to impart to a body a new nature or natures, or secondarily, to transform within the limits of the possible one body into another. Human knowledge seeks the true differences or source of a given nature, or secondarily, to discover the hidden processes in every case of generation and motion and the hidden structure of bodies at rest. Human knowledge asks why a thing is what it is. Human power seeks to make a thing other than it is. I have emphasized the phrase, quote, within the limits of the possible, because I think this is the key notion that is shared by the one concerned with works and the one concerned with knowledge of nature. Indeed, I think this is what his new science aims to discover. In the famous second aphorism, Bacon declares, on the basis of we know not what inquiry or inquiries, that, quote, nothing really exists in nature besides individual bodies carrying out pure individual acts according to law. He then calls by the name of form those laws that set the limits to nature. To discover a form, then, is to discover a limit to the possible. In the Baconian example, it is the inseparability of heat and motion. To use an Aristotelian example, we might say the inseparability of shape and color. Now, in the third aphorism, Bacon suggests that knowledge of the forms, as distinct from partial knowledge of contingent material or efficient causes, leads to true contemplation and free operation. But I think we should read the free here as free as possible, for presumably whatever magic one could perform would have to abide by the laws or the forms. Otherwise, they weren't really laws to begin with. And this, I think, is the key. Whatever remarkable effects we can produce, we do so within and according to the limits set by nature. The fourth aphorism then completes this movement. For at its outset, Bacon frankly allows that, quote, the way to human power and human knowledge are not identical, but only almost. Quote, yet because of the pernicious and inveterate custom of dealing in abstractions, it is safer to raise and organize the sciences on foundations which align with the active part, so that this may stamp and determine the contemplative part. Paraphrasing, we should allow the sciences to be guided by practical concerns because these are less prone to abstraction. Recalling that the human intellect's tendency to abstraction was the final of the idols of the tribe Bacon commented on in Book 1. Practice, or the concerns of practice, keep us grounded in particulars and preclude our too hasty leap or flight to generalities. Bacon supports this remarkable suggestion with three telling examples. Say someone wanted, I don't know, yellowish colored silver, or rocks that are sort of crystalline, transparent, and very sparkly, or crops that could grow anywhere. Who would want such things, and why? Bacon hereby points to one of the major and most questionable consequences of allowing the bent of a science to be set by practical concerns, by what someone would most wish for. What do people wish for? Cheap gold, not the truth about nature. And yet Bacon here shows that he's willing to grasp this nettle. And why? Because he says, in seeking reliable, available, and easy means to make gold or diamonds, or to grow crops in barren soil, we will be led to the discovery of true forms. Quote, for the form of any nature is such that if it be in place, the given nature invariably follows. Thus it is constantly present when that nature is present, and universally asserts it, and inheres in the whole of it. The same form is such that if it departs, the given nature infallibly disappears. Lastly, a true form is such that it draws up the given nature from some source of being which inheres in many other things, and is, as they put it, better known to nature than the form itself. And from this, Bacon concludes that these two prescriptions, the active and the contemplative, are the same. From what is most useful in operation is most true in knowing. tricky Bacon. Recall, the aphorism began with Bacon conceding that the way to human power and human knowledge are only almost identical or only close together, but the aphorism concludes with their identity. So which is it? Is he pretending to give us knowledge while really aiming at art or power? Or is he using the promise of mastery to lead us to discovery? In support of the latter, we might observe that from the standpoint of operation or a concern to make cheap gold, one needs only a reliable, available, and easy mode of transferring a property found in one body to another to give to silver the yellowness of gold. Bacon, however, concludes from this that what we should want from operation is a means of infallibly imparting yellowness in any case we wish, drawing up the given nature from a source of being inherent in many other things or better known to nature. Bacon is therefore clearly exaggerating about what is needed for the purposes of operation, to the end, it would seem, of leading us beyond reliable means of satisfying a popular desire to the discovery of, quote, the source of being of the desired quality or nature. This casts a revealing light on Bacon's oft-repeated demand that we not let our impatience for fruit or works lead us to break off our inquiries prematurely, chasing after the golden apples like Atalanta. That we have the patience to imitate the Creator and to seek light first and fruit only second. Or his repeated promises that by inquiring even into mundane, lowly, and familiar matters, or matters that have no direct bearing on us, like the motions and matter of the heavenly bodies, we will actually be advancing our potential operative powers. That such a ruse could be effective is clear today in our scientists' insistence that by funding so-called basic science, we are in fact preparing the way to future works. At any rate, this strikes me as a crucial passage for disclosing first the theoretical concern that is, in my view, ultimate for Bacon, despite his hard-headed acceptance that this concern cannot be the grounds for its public support. And secondly, for confirming my suggestion that the technological or operational aim so powerfully advanced by Bacon is intended also to serve the cause of disclosing the truth. In the second aphorism of the second part, Bacon accepts the received notion that, quote, to know truly is to know by causes. And he further admits the establishment of four causes: material, formal, efficient, and final. His complaint focuses on the superficiality of the prevailing attempt to investigate material and efficient cause, and the despair attending the discovery of forms. Bacon too seeks forms, but as we have seen, forms now understood as the laws limiting the possibilities inherent in matter. But Bacon is not an atomist. For Bacon, atomism is every bit the anticipation of nature or the leap to first principles for which he faults Aristotelianism. Rather, Bacon proposes a materialism that, while ascribing no particular properties to matter, attributes to matter and its appetites or passions whatever limits there are to what can be. On this account, the kinds that show themselves in the ordinary course of things are merely accidental or contingent conglomerations of forms or laws. The world we encounter, then, is but one possible world. The things we encounter could be otherwise. As he puts it in the important Proteus fable from the Wisdom of the Ancient, for the source of being which inheres in many other things, the universe of things, that is the structure and fabric of ordinary species, is of matter not constricted or bound, a herd of material things. Nonetheless, if some skilled minister of nature summons force to matter and vexes and urges it to its end and proposes to reduce it to nothing, since annihilation and true destruction is not possible except by omnipotent God, placed by necessity, he turns and wills himself into wondrous transformations and shapes, so that if the force is continued at length as in a circle, he completes the period and restores himself. Prior to the attempt, however, Bacon cannot possibly know this. He cannot possibly know that there is a finite number of possibilities, and that these will show themselves to the skilled minister of nature. Indeed, he cannot even know that all the forms or kinds which we encounter could be other than they are. But what I suggest he does know is that without the attempt, accepting nature as it shows itself to us, Relying on a grossly incomplete catalog of natural phenomenon, we cannot claim to know that the kinds indicate anything whatsoever about what is necessary. Art, Bacon observes, strips the mask and veil from natural things which generally lie concealed or hidden beneath the variety of shapes and outward appearances. By constraining and vexing nature through experiment, by attending in particular to monsters or deviating instances, nature's eccentricities, which Bacon calls monadic instances, and above all to works and wonders of art, instances of the hand of man, we are afforded a glimpse past the kinds and species. In attending to the alternative manifestations of things revealed by art and occasionally by nature, in generating more of them, we find that the things that we ordinarily encounter are capable of being otherwise. They are not necessary, and they do not disclose the genuine limits to possibility. But nor is it the case that we find that anything is possible. What we want from inquiry into nature, secure knowledge of what is and is not possible, can be had to the extent that it can be had only by actively pressing nature. Our access to these limits comes only indirectly, through an ongoing and perhaps never completed effort to actively seek them out. By stoking and harnessing human passions for a world other than that which we find ourselves in, we will be brought ever closer to seeing it as it truly is and must be. True, from the standpoint of our desire for rest and a cessation of our labors, such a project might appear Sisyphean, but less so, or otherwise, to the one who knows already that rest belongs only to angels and that our fate is to earn our bread by the sweat of our brows. Thank you.
Thank you, Tobin. That was terrific. What we want to do now is have you folks in the audience feel free to turn on your cameras if you'd like, but it's time to ask questions. So you can either raise your real hand if you're on video, or go down to reactions and click the raise hand button, and we can get as many folks in before 1:30 Mountain Time as we can. So, and we like student questions. So if I see a student, I'm going to go to a student. Alex, I see you. I know you can't wait. Is there a student before I call on Alex? Okay. All right. Alex, you can warm us up. Go ahead, Alex.
All right. Thank you. I'm a student of nature, so
it's true.
I think that still counts. It's good to see you, Tobin. That was a great talk. I mean, every time I had a question, you said something that then answered it and gave me a new question. And you really, I think, I don't know, for the undergraduates here, I think this was a treat for them. But a question I have is, when he talks about the forms, these fundamental sort of, you don't want to use atomism, but like building blocks, right? Or something like that, that you work up towards the forms that we see and experience, the natures that we encounter in the ordinary world, and also the works that we can make from them, right? One question I always have, and he says, right, that if you could work from that, basic level, you would have what's essentially a scientific equivalent of what we expect in magic or alchemy, right? So my question is always, does Bacon actually think this fundamental induction is possible? That's like a first question. Can you actually get to the true forms or the sort of basic building blocks of nature? And second, if not, which is what I suspect, but I'm not sure of, if then can we ever actually with confidence reduce the things we experience to this basic stuff? You pointed out at a couple of points that this is kind of a sort of promissory assertion, right? That the ontology presents as sort of like, this is what I think nature might have to be like for us to pull off the kind of science that I want. But if we don't ever complete it, then can we really just reduce, and here maybe I'm tipping my hat, human beings, living entities, and all the moral categories that are based on that to these sort of basic materialist building blocks? And then a second small question, what that line on Aristotle and alchemy, where was that? I missed your reference when you stated it.
All right, so the weakness of Aristotelian philosophy and works has produced in some places a high regard for alchemy. I'm going to say that's in an unpublished fragmentary draft of the great instauration that's called the Redargutio Philosophiarum, but it's translated as the Refutation of Philosophies in a collection of 3 works, and the translator is Farrington, I think. I'm pretty sure that's where it is, and if you don't find it there, let me know. And that was in the context of talking about or trying to spell out what he said in the Proem to the Interpretation of Nature, which right now only exists in the Spedding, Ellis, and Heath edition of Bacon's works. So the important questions you ask, yeah, if my reading is, if I'm on the right track, then I don't want to say Bacon knows already that it's impossible to arrive at the comprehensive natural magic that he seems to be promising in the early aphorisms of Book 2 of the New Organon, like total, you'd say, qualified omnipotence. I mean, within the bounds set by the nature of things, I can do everything, right? And he seems to invite us to dream of a situation in which we could put together any set of qualities, any set of traits, and we could create any kind of, but what I'm suggesting is that the crucial phrase in the early aphorisms here is within the limits of the possible, or the termini possibilis, and you can actually follow this through the New Organon, and it's a very interesting thing that it shows you. I think Bacon suspects that there are limits to the possible configurations and conjunctions of things. And so, but we'll never discover what those limits are without an active effort to sort of find them. That's the line that I'm suggesting. Now, you say, well, then if you can't get all the way there, then why are you presumptively leaping past the kinds or the species as they show themselves? And here Bacon, I think, would take a different tact. He would say, we know in some familiar and ready to hand cases that the kinds that show themselves can be otherwise. In other words, the nature as it shows itself in its ordinary course is not the only possible manifestation. And here he's interested in the findings of art, the early findings of early alchemy, but also the newly discovered instances that are constantly be generated by the exploration of the world, et cetera, and so on. He says, we know enough to know the kinds don't exhaust what's possible. So why do we accept so readily that we can't get beyond the kinds? This is not the same thing as to say all kinds are capable of being other than they are, and that I can reduce the being of the kind of any particular kind to the parts or the passions of the parts out of which they're composed. You see what I'm saying? There's a kind of halfway house, I would suggest, between dogmatic reductionism and I don't know. I don't know if you couldn't find, a kind that didn't have X or Y quality, which I thought up to this point had been definitive of that kind, if that makes sense. So that's how I read what he is, how he would answer that line of argument.
Paul, yeah, go ahead.
Can you guys hear me?
Yeah.
Alex, did you want to follow that up? I don't want to break the flow.
I'll just note that that's like the ancient problem of mules, right? He'd like to try to see if he can solve that. But yeah, no, I get it.
Mules? Do you say mules?
Yeah, mules. Yeah.
Yeah, right. Yeah, I like to speak about ungulates too. So could there be an is a jackalope possible? Or is there something in the nature of the rabbit that precludes antlers, or in the nature of the ungulate that precludes rodent-like characteristics or loop. I guess it would be rabbit characteristics. Yeah.
Tobin, or Professor Craig, I should say, would you? It seems to me that what you're driving at is some formulation like this: that the theoretical objectives of Bacon's science, in some sense, abandon the hopes of knowing necessity, hopes that are perhaps articulated or furnished in the ancient sense, and they're replaced by an objective that seems to just want to be less wrong about what's possible. So we're because we have to go beyond the senses, that in some sense takes the possibility of a completed knowledge or a completed systematic or exhaustive account of the external world more or less off the table, as I think Bacon sort of intimates. But he is saying that by going beyond the senses methodologically, we can be less wrong about what's possible, less wrong about a putative necessity, and have a much more expansive vision of how the ingredients of nature can function in ways that are discernible to us. Would you agree with that kind of formulation, or do you think that I'm missing something?
I mean, I'd have to think about it, see whether there's anything there that I would quarrel with. But I think, yeah, I'd say that's essentially, that's one of the things that he's aiming at. You could say the dogmatism, in the second part of my talk, where I call our attention to the ways in which the Aristotelian doctrine of nature was probably constructed in light of, but certainly meshed perfectly with, natural human tendencies, to solidify into a kind of, a dogmatism that precluded even seeing the limitations of this account of things. And this, if you put it together with what I was saying in the first part, is actually a very fragile edifice, because if anomalous phenomenon show themselves, or if you're confronted by things that cannot be made sense of in light of this doctrine, then the threat is always to not just to that doctrine, but to the possibility of philosophy as such, that really the house of learning is on the line when the doctrine is called into question, because of the tightness and purported completeness of the received account. And so Bacon wants to devise a scientific or philosophical tradition that, unlike the Aristotelian, doesn't calcify into a dogmatism, but remains open. Nature remains open as a question. And of course, it requires some kind of an anticipatory ontology to make this work, but it's not going to settle. And why is it not going to settle? Because we're always going to be demanding more and other things that, I think that's part of the secret of harnessing the human passions by means of the promise of technological mastery or power. So I don't know if that adds anything to what you're saying, but I'm just trying to sort of, like, part of what I'm trying to do in this talk is give you kind of big picture, and then show how the various facets of this argument fit together. But I don't know if I addressed what you were really driving at, Paul.
No, what you say is helpful to me. I feel like your talk today really helped me to crystallize some of the key ways in which Bacon's theoretical ambition really is quite distinct from the ancient approach. I mean, depending on how you read Aristotle, it seems to me Aristotle would want to push the bounds of accessible knowledge within the framework of the world as it's given to us, Bacon thinks that we can really understand certain patterns or constraints that go well beyond perception.
Yeah.
And that's very different. That to me is just a different kind of theoretical object.
Yeah, and I would say Bacon is very concerned, and you read New Organon and you read it carefully and with an open mind. He's very concerned to not let our speculations get ahead of ourselves on the basis of new experiments or new discoveries, right? He's very concerned, like the Gilbert problem, if you want to put it this way, right? Gilbert discovers some amazing things about magnets, and then the whole world is a magnet. Like everything is magnetism. Magnetism explains gravity. Magnetism explains the motions of the heavenly spheres. Magnetism explains life. Magnetism is everything, right? And he's like very worried about this. And this is sort of the fact that he's conscious about this means that he's concerned to remain in contact with the phenomenon, right? But as I was, I think I've put this to you in comments before, but he's prepared to take a step or two beyond the immediately perceptible or the perceptible as disclosed in speech or conversation about the perceptible. He's prepared to take a step or two beyond that when and where, the evidence seems to warrant it. It doesn't look like there's a bazillion people raising their hands. Let me just deduce a real good example that was, see, Bernard Trout wants to, Professor Trout.
We can come back to Paul in a minute. Go ahead.
No, go ahead. Why don't you finish that line and then I'll.
Well, I was just going to say, here's an interesting example that would have been available to Bacon that I find quite interesting. Right, so you take an ingot of silver and you put it in nitric acid and it completely dissolves into a blue solution, okay? Already pretty weird. If you're not prepared to say that something can become nothing, you got to do some pretty fancy thinking to explain what just happened to that ingot of silver, right? Now let's warm it, I think, together with sulfur, and you can precipitate this. You can precipitate the silver back out of the solution, right? So if you're not prepared to say something comes from nothing, you've got to explain what happened to that silver, where it went, what and how you. Therefore, silver isn't necessarily the cluster of things that we tend to think silver has to be. Like an Aristotelian would say, what is silver, right? And it would have to be a metal of such and such malleability with certain properties, et cetera, and so on. And Bacon's going to have to say, like, riddle me this, it looks to me like you can have that silver went somewhere else and yet it came back again. So what you thought was necessary was a necessary feature of silverness might not have been quite as necessary as you thought it was. And again, what does that mean? What conclusions can you draw? How important is it that you insist that the silver was always there and didn't just disappear and reappear? These are, high questions about which I can't profess to have complete understanding, but I am trying to elucidate what I think Bacon is getting at. And I think that's an example that helps, is maybe helpful. Sorry if that's long-winded.
No, thank you so much. Professor Trout, please.
Yeah, thank you also for your talk. And I have, I guess, a somewhat compound, but hopefully not too long question, very much related to the previous two. So I think your talk has really opened up, I think, some of the fundamental questions of understanding Bacon. So you started out, I guess, after your allusion to sports, by saying that you're going to discuss the reasons why you think Bacon is a philosopher as such. you didn't really define it, and perhaps there are different ways of defining what a philosopher is. And along those lines, we've been talking, you were talking in the question period, we've been talking about Aristotle and Bacon's approach to, let's say, set the stage clean from Aristotelian thought and start anew. And he certainly uses that kind of language, as you pointed out. In your view, and related to the question of what a philosopher is that actually Aristotle, or the dogmatism, or let's say the ossification, the ossified Aristotelianism that had emerged after 2000 years?
Yeah.
And then related to that, it seems that at least all the current empirical evidence is that Bacon's thought has been utterly ossified, perhaps as bad, if not worse, than Aristotle's. So did he mess up in his approach, or was that really what he was attempting to do? And finally, and hopefully related to that, if the approach is to, let's say, address the idols by this great intellectual feat over and over again and clear the slate of potential dogma, how does Bacon's thought not lead to nihilism, or does it?
I mean, I feel sheepish saying this. I mean, I don't know about Aristotle. I don't know about Aristotle anymore. You know, a person might have thought they knew something about Aristotle, but then you look again and you realize you didn't know what you thought you knew. I feel safer saying that Bacon did think that from the beginning, Aristotle's effort at founding a philosophic tradition was sort of mistaken, in the sense that so concerned to establish the possibility of knowing nature, he had to give to his teaching an appearance of completeness that maybe he himself knew it didn't necessarily have, right? And here you have to think, like, what's involved in a philosophic tradition? A philosophic tradition requires people to believe that the enterprise is good, admirable, and possible, such that they want to dedicate themselves to the cause of advancing it. And in order to do that, they need some guarantee or certainty that the enterprise makes sense or is intelligible. And so the one who would try to establish such a tradition has to give an appearance of knowledge, even as their intention is ultimately to advance inquiry, if I can put it that way. So that, I would say, rhetorical, pedagogical insight that Bacon has sort of allows us to set the question aside as to whether Aristotle himself knew he was peddling a doctrine that was less adequate than he appeared to teach. And then just to repeat something that I think I was trying to suggest in the talk, whatever the case might have been, the situation of European learning and now is in a very precarious situation, because it is totally wedded to this Christian Aristotelian synthesis at a moment in which we have competing and warring Christianities, each of which are sort of in a battle to purify themselves of any late accretions that don't belong with the true faith. And so and plus, there's a mounting list of anomalies that don't seem to square with Aristotelian doctrines, right? I mean, new stars in the sky, immaculate heavens, right? Galileo's findings, of which Bacon's familiar. I could go on. There's certain of the points about alchemy. So that much with respect to Aristotle, you know, and I have to just beg off being able to answer it with any kind of real confidence. Has Bacon's thought ossified? Here, Dr. Trout, I want you to tell me what in particular you have in mind when you say modern science has ossified into a dogmatism of its own that's also failing to advance the cause of discovering more of nature.
Oh, well, I would say in the sense that, let's say very few, if anyone, would speak out against science, that modern science is not the approach to understanding nature.
Oh, yeah.
I think that probably, aside from very few places, perhaps Herbst's program, all institutions of higher learning would not even contemplate anything outside of that dogma, and it's sort of used, you know, in a much more peaceful way than the wars of religion of the time you refer to, but as a club, you know, you're in the sense, oh, you're not being scientific enough, or that isn't science, or and
Science
they're
is
very
real.
basic.
The button.
Oh,
Yeah.
just to give an example, I mean, there are very basic things that no one ever thinks twice about, like atoms or other things, which are themselves perhaps problematic when one thinks twice.
Yeah, excellent. Right. You know, it probably, I mean, too many points just occur to me right away. I mean, I guess, you know, if you really, really push me, and since there's only a few of us still, well, I'm probably going to be recorded and this will be posted online for eternity. And so I'll have to be able to defend this. So that makes me hesitant to say what, I mean, I think in many respects, we haven't followed Bacon's, however successful Bacon has been in establishing this new kind of natural philosophical tradition, you know, in some pretty important respects, some pretty non-trivial respects, we haven't followed Bacon's guidance or advice, right? I think he was, I think, you know, this could be said of many of the early modern philosophers, too confident that the generations that follow would appreciate the nuance, the qualifications, the complexities that they had worked into their sort of foundational texts, which would, I think they might have hoped, keep alive a certain self-consciousness or awareness about the limitations of the teaching. So there's a kind of tendency for enlightenment to forget, you know, as it moves forward, to forget what was perhaps known at the beginning or at the founding, right? And this is something that's been commented on by most of the really insightful historians of philosophy and science over the last century. And, you know, this is most familiar to me in Bacon's writings on the relationship between politics and science, you know, where, you know, the preconditions for the successful institutionalization of science, as they are presented to us in the New Atlantis, we don't follow many of those, right? And so that means that we're deviating and departing from the recommendations Bacon led, or the guidance that he had to offer. And I think that's probably true with respect to the science in particular. Let me just, one thing that's jumped out at me recently, a sort of thing that I saw recently. Like when you read The Great Instauration, you almost can't help but imagine or think of it in terms of a massive multi-generational and hugely organized collective enterprise, right? And really with the stress being like almost epochal stages, you know, first you do stage 1, then you do stage 2, then you do stage 3, et cetera, and so on, right? But then when he pictures the science in action and in work in the New Atlantis, it's much more constrained and consolidated, and all the dimensions or all the parts of the great instauration are being undertaken simultaneously by different people in the same institution. Moreover, they are at that time hierarchically ordered such that, for example, the pathologies that go with hyperspecialization are corrected against, right? So in many of these ways, I think we don't follow Bacon's advice closely, and we could learn something about, let me say, keeping the philosophic promise of our great science alive if we return to Bacon on that matter. Does Bacon's thought culminate in nihilism? Maybe this is a related question. No, I think not. I think very clearly Bacon seems to hold forth he seems to claim that we can know the goodness of knowing, that this is the highest good of man, that certain of the what should we say, core beliefs that we need in order to sustain and maintain a healthy and decent life, these can be they don't necessitate, they're not in a necessary tension with the ongoing efforts of our science. Again, this may require the ever-present renewal of people who can point out when we are hastily drawing conclusions that aren't warranted from our sciences with respect to, say, human things or moral matters. And maybe you could say Bacon was overly optimistic that such people would always be around and would keep alive that kind of understanding or modesty. So I don't know. It's none of those answers are perhaps ultimately satisfactory, Dr. Trout. But
It was very good, thank you. And I won't take more time, but just to say about the New Atlantis, I agree. I think there's a lot that the modern science institution can learn from that. But I'll just add that at least we do have the Adam and Eve pools.
Is there any other questions? I see people with their cameras turned off. You're welcome to ask a question. We only have a few minutes left, so I don't want to leave anyone behind. No, anyone from the top row? Paul, one more. All right, we can always rely on Paul. Go ahead, man.
Can you guys hear me okay? All right. I was just curious, Tobin, whether you think that the expectation that there should be methodological coherence in the sciences is either in accord with Bacon or not, because it seems to me that if we're pushing past a kind of anticipatory necessity or the governing sort of opinions that are stuck in the domain of anticipation, that the sciences really will over time perhaps fractalize into a kind of methodological eclecticism. And that when you hear philosophers of science sort of complain or sort of arch reductionists say that we've got to have a kind of vertically integrated science that functions from the hard physics and sort of moves in a nice set of graduated phases, that this might actually not be consistent with the Baconian vision. What do you think about that?
yeah, absolutely. My text is just out of reach, but yeah, I mean, I think you could very clearly see that Bacon acknowledges that while it's meaningful to call it all one enterprise in the sense, and it is even meaningful, I don't use the word method. I know Kennington and many Bacon scholars are comfortable. It's just not the word Bacon uses. Bacon only speaks of way, and he actually uses method to speak about something else that's different. So, but maybe we can loosely say it all follows one way method, in the loose sense of being inductive, of being dedicated to the accumulation of the maximum number of instances, relevant phenomenon, that it is not narrowly looking at one particular species or kind, but looking for patterns that cut across the kinds, et cetera, and so on. So you can speak of certain broad principles that the science adheres to, but Bacon is perfectly content that astronomy conduct its inquiries in a different way than, biology does, or something like that, and perhaps they could all benefit from his sort of tables of induction method, and his recommendations that you go search for problematic instances or challenging instances of certain kinds. But I don't think that there's really, apart from the level of the anticipatory ontology, which makes a grand claim about the truth of all nature, I don't think that he's wedded to a dogmatic reductionism that says all sciences must sort of, as you say, vertically integrate in a particular fashion, and they must be investigated in the same way, right? So, I mean, this is clearest when he starts to talk about what he calls in the first 10 aphorisms of New Organon, the lesser theoretical aim of uncovering the hidden processes whereby a thing comes to be and the hidden structure of any being, right? So he'd be very interested in something like Linnaean anatomy or morphology, just as he would also be interested in cellular and molecular biology, right? He would ultimately, I think, hope that the pieces would come together and that there would be a sort of synthetic view, but I think he's less invested in that than our philosophers of science or prophets of scientism might tend to be.
Well, thank you, Tobin, and thank you everybody for attending. This was really wonderful. It was great to see you, Tobin.
Thank you very much for having me. It was it's rare that I'm able to talk on such matters and have so many people familiar who can ask probing questions. And for the students in the audience, I wish you all best in your studies and inquiries. Hope something that I had to say was of use to you.
All right. Yeah, very much of use. And thank you, everybody. Be sure to check out the Engineering Leadership Program. We'll do more of these talks in the spring semester and take our courses, take Herb's program courses. And everybody have a good afternoon.
Thank you
Thank
very
you.
much. Thanks,
Bye.
Charlie.
You.